He's a really talented JavaScript developer. I think you'll learn a lot. He's been involved with Backbone right before, and so he's a cool guy. I think you'll like it.
Thanks. All right, so I'm here today to talk about JavaScript, and so this is a PHP conference, I hear, so this should be interesting. We'll see how it goes. So yeah, I'm Tim Griesser. I'm T Griesser on Twitter, GitHub, and IRC. I'm usually idling in the Laravel IRC, so if you ever have any JavaScript-related questions, feel free to find me there and ping me. I'm always open to answering questions. And I really like writing JavaScript, so I'm one of the collaborators on the Backbone JS project, which I'm sure some of you have probably at least heard of or maybe used. All right, to some degree. And I've also written a lot of PHP, too. So I have been using Laravel since version 3 to build out some applications. And before that, I was using Fuel, and before that, CodeIgniter. So I'm sure there's probably some people here that have followed a similar path. And a funny story, actually, is that last year I came to the inaugural LaraCon in DC, and at one of the breaks, I went up to Taylor and I said, "Hey, Taylor, great work on the framework. I've been using it, really like it a lot, and I'm working on this project right now that you might find sort of interesting. I'm trying to port the query builder and the ORM Eloquent in Laravel to JavaScript to Node." And he gave me this look like, who is this crazy person that's talking to me right now? But about a year ago, I released these two projects, Connects and Bookshelf, which are essentially the query builder and the ORM from Laravel sort of ported to JavaScript. So it's cool that even the JavaScript community has been able to benefit from the great work of Laravel and the great community. So when I was coming up with ideas for this talk, I was sort of at a loss. I mean, it is a PHP conference, so obviously I was looking to see if there was something I was missing, like maybe I haven't been paying attention, see if there's any JavaScript. And of course, there's no JavaScript anywhere to be found in the entire framework. So I was thinking, what is it? Why do they want me here? And then I saw all these tweets that Taylor was hyping up this big unveiling or something. So I was thinking that maybe he was planning on releasing. So I really hope it's not that. Otherwise, I just ruin the surprise, I guess. He won't tell me. So. But I think the real reason is that it's not really a PHP conference. It's a Laravel conference, and Laravel is a PHP framework for web artisans. And so if you're doing anything on the web, JavaScript has this monopoly on the web, basically. It's the only language that can run in the browser. So everyone at some point in their career has to write some form of JavaScript or debug it or just get stuck with it. I'd be surprised if anyone here has never read or written or done anything with JavaScript before. If you have, talk to me after. I'd be interested to hear. But it's also a conference for web artisans. So that sort of implies that you really don't like code that looks like this, I guess. There's probably so many things going wrong here that I can't even take the time to go through it, and I probably gave some people heart attacks just looking at this. You much prefer code that looks like this, where you've got your namespaces and your interfaces and protected properties, and everything's nice and doc blocked, and there's plenty of space, and the code has room to breathe. But nobody starts off writing code that looks like this. Everybody sort of goes through this process of writing awful code and getting burned by it when you have to go refactor it later. And you're like, there's got to be a better way to do this. So you come to the conferences and you watch the Jeffrey Way screencasts and you read all the books and listen to all the talks and figure out how to write code that looks like this. But then you're probably thinking to yourself, well, but it's just JavaScript. So does it really matter? Do I have to learn how to do domain-driven design like JavaScript? Yeah, surely I can just add some jQuery here and there on the page and post some AJAX or move some things around in the DOM. And truthfully, it doesn't matter that much. It's not that big of a deal. You can definitely get by and fulfill the requirements of the project. If all you need is a little JavaScript here and there for some animation, definitely. But then a project comes along where the JavaScript that's needed is maybe outside of your comfort zone, or you inherit a project that has a whole bunch of JavaScript in it that you have to read and debug, and you're just sort of unsure. It's sort of outside of your level of knowledge of JavaScript. Or a client comes to you and asks you to build what's sort of the hot new trend of a single-page web app. So a great example of that is the Snappy web application by Userscape. They're using Backbone.js, actually. And we're just going to abbreviate this to SPA, just because we're developers and we like to abbreviate things. So a typical SPA architecture follows what's known as the fat client and the skinny server model. So you start out building the application the way you know. You've got your skinny server with your routes, and you make sure to set them up nice and restfully. They're versioned and sending the proper headers and everything. And you make sure that all of your code is solid. So you're following all the best practices, making sure DDD and all the best techniques there. And you hook it up to your services. So you've got your Amazon PHP hooked up, and you got your database and your cache and all of your services hooked up. And then you make it hexagonal, which I don't even know what that means, but I assume it's a good thing. I was told it's a good thing. We'll find out tomorrow, I guess. But let's assume you do that. And so your server, I guess, is hooked up really nicely, and you're feeling really good about it. And then you jump to the client. And so the client is a little different. This is the fat client. And what you have on the client then is just a mess of jQuery. And this works. And these two talk. And the project's humming along. And then some new requirements come in. And they ask you to add some features that were maybe missing. So what do you do in a single-page application? You just throw more JavaScript at it. Because the solution to a single-page web app is always more JavaScript. Even if the problem is better served on the server, it wouldn't be a single-page web app if you weren't throwing more JavaScript at the problem. So this continues to work. And then the client comes to you with more requirements, or your project goals shift, and you have to move a lot of this stuff around. And when you go to do that, then it just becomes a buggy mess of jQuery and JavaScript, and your app's broken, and you're just tearing your hair out trying to fix it. And then you give up on the single-page application architecture, and you sort of like curse JavaScript. And I've seen this happen several times in different situations, so I know I'm not the only one that has had this happen. And so you think, OK, well, maybe this was the case when I was writing my PHP code, where I could learn how to do this a little better. Maybe there's something I'm missing with modern JavaScript, that there's some better approaches. So you take a look at the JavaScript community, and you find that we have 3 different competing package managers. Nobody can really seem to decide on. We've got all these different asset pipelines. So Grunt has been a powerhouse for a while, and then Gulp came along in the past couple of months, and now Jeffrey Way is all big on that one. And then I was just told about Broccoli earlier today. It was described as Gulp on meth. So I figured I'd include it. And I'm sure there's many others. And then you want to make your code nice and modular. So you have Require.js, which has been popular for a while, but now everybody seems to be shifting toward Browserify. And then because JavaScript has this monopoly on the front end, we need to break that up. So we have all these different compile-to languages, like CoffeeScript, which is great. TypeScript is made by Microsoft, so it must be great, too. We've got ClojureScript, so if you're big in Lisp, you can make your JavaScript Lispy and do it that way. And then we have all these different frameworks piled on top, to learn. And then we even have like a meta build tool, because doing all of this by hand is too much. So you must be cranking out JavaScript apps to need that. I haven't needed it personally yet. And the real reason is just like we want cool-looking laptops, obviously. So you think, what is wrong with these JavaScript people? Why can't they decide on anything? Why can't they have something like the framework integration group? Or why is there so much? Everybody seems to be reinventing the wheel. What's going on? Why do they have 36 different ways to build a to-do list app with frameworks? This is like the golden age of to-do lists. If you have a to-do list, you have so many different ways to build it. And I didn't think this was that bad, because I actually recognized most of the frameworks on this list. So I was like, OK, well, they all do sort of different things. That's not terrible. But then I realized that was just above the fold. And then we have all these other ways to do it with compile to and real time and all this. So the reason I think this is the case is that JavaScript is really subjective. So unlike in a server-side language like PHP, where if there's a bottleneck, you can always get a bigger server or throw more cache or RAM or just different services to speed things up. JavaScript has sort of traditionally come from the standpoint of you can't throw more CPU at an iPhone or an Android or an IE browser. So everybody in the JavaScript community has been really sort of almost unnecessarily focused on performance, sometimes where it doesn't even matter, and you end up with just everybody sort of having their own little way of doing things which target different platforms. And JavaScript is also a really flexible language. So it's got a much smaller footprint, just the core language, than PHP. It's got, it can be used in a lot of different ways. It can either be used functionally. If you look at like _JS, you can see that functions are first class. They can be passed around. You've got closures, which are now available in PHP. And it can also be it's extremely object-oriented too, or it can be with prototypes. And it's kind of funny that the prototypes, like pure class-based object-oriented people will say like, oh, JavaScript's sort of, it's not truly object-oriented. It uses this weird prototype thing. And then the pure functional programmers will look at it and say, well, it's not really functional. Everything is like mutable, and so everybody like hates on JavaScript. But so that's just sort of a primer as to sort of the state of where things are. So I think we're just going to take a look at a few of the different frameworks that you might be going to use if you're going to be writing an application like this. So the first one you might look at is Backbone. This one has been around for a while, and it's touted as a library, not a framework. It's pretty small. It's only, I think, 1,700 lines of code right now. And it really prides itself on keeping everything really small and not trying to add too many features, which is a good and a bad thing, I guess you could say. Like if you try to open a pull request on Backbone, typically it'll be closed within like half an hour, saying like, well, here's these other tickets where somebody tried to implement this and it's like outside of the scope. So then you have all of these different frameworks that are sort of built on top of Backbone that are needed really to make it useful. So like I said, yeah, it provides the minimal set of data structuring, models and collections, and UI primitives. And it does take pretty strong opinions on how the models work. So that's why I was able to sort of combine Backbone's models and collections with Eloquent and make this sort of mashup. It actually uses the Backbone JS code to some degree, the library that I built. It's very light and sort of focuses on the models and making sure that when you call save, it syncs in a certain way. But it really doesn't give you much to go on with regards to views and UI and how you're supposed to structure your project. And it does have an awesome real-world apps list on its website, and Snappy can be added to that as well, obviously. But that also comes with the fact that these big apps like Pandora or USA Today probably also have just teams of awesome JavaScript developers that are cranking these out, and so it's sort of a trade-off there. It does do a good job. So the next one that you'd probably take a look at is Ember. So this one is probably the most like Laravel. It takes the batteries included approach and sort of gives you a lot. It's more full stack, and it's touted for building ambitious web applications. So I've seen some really great apps that people have been building with it. And it also has much more of a community built around it, which I think is something that has been really cool to see about the Laravel community. So you might find it useful. People complain it has a slightly larger footprint with 71. I took this right off their website. But it's not that big, really. It's like the size of a medium-sized image. So it gets cached and no big deal. The next big framework is Angular. So this one is HTML enhanced. It gives you ways to encapsulate sort of style and behavior into these directives, which are sort of like custom HTML tags, basically. And it uses dependency injection and IOC, which is also familiar from Laravel. So you might find some of those concepts pretty neat. And promises were touched on earlier today with the React PHP stuff. So it gives a good way to make asynchronous code sort of not as hard to deal with the callback hell. And this one has been gaining a ton of momentum. There's a lot of people using it, and it's a good one to learn. And the 2.0 will be more, there's a web component spec that has come out, and it's going to sort of move toward that and also make the code base more modular, so you can sort of pull out just the dependency injection piece or just the directives piece and sort of use them on their own. The next one that I'm going to mention, just because it's a lot newer, so people might not have been as familiar with it. It's not at all related to the React PHP. It's React.js by Facebook, and they're way out in left field. They have said that basically you don't need any of this MVC stuff. All that is trying to do is to manage state. And so we're just going to make it so that you can't change the state of the DOM. Anytime that you update properties, we just re-render everything that touches that property. And so it has this focus on immutability, and it's just a really cool, it creates this virtual DOM in memory, and anytime you update something, it aggregates all of the changes and basically diffs against this virtual DOM to see what it needs to update on the page, and it just does that all at once. So it's comparable to Angular, but it's way easier to pick up, I guess you could say. Like there's only one method you really need to implement, and that's render. And every time that something updates, it just calls the render again and again. So this is also a pretty cool framework to take a look at. And so here's the GitHub stars, because that's a pretty important metric, obviously, for everyone. Very reliable. But you're probably thinking, which of these would I want to use if I'm going out to build an application? You've got Backbone, very small, a lot of people using it. You've got Ember, more full stack, similar to what you might, less of a learning curve maybe. React's got this crazy thing. And I think some people might disagree with my choice here, but I don't think it really matters. So if the make or break of your application is which JavaScript framework you start off with, then you're going to have bigger problems than that. And I think all of them are going to be, Backbone's going to be around for a while. It's not going anywhere, I can tell you that. React is being used in production by Facebook and Instagram, so it must be good, obviously. We've seen what they've done with Hip Hop Virtual Machine. And Angular, I don't know with Google. They seem to deprecate or just drop products here and there, so I don't know. But all of them are good choices, really. And so what am I going to talk about then? So the rest of the talk are going to be sort of some things that coming to JavaScript from PHP weren't sort of immediately obvious. There's plenty of books. People recommend The Good Parts by Douglas Crockford. I don't know if anybody's read that here. All right. And so, there's some things that I read that book, and then I wrote JavaScript. And then I just recently came back to the JavaScript I had written after that, and I was like, I must have missed what the good parts were, because I was just horrified at what I'd written. So we're going to talk about debugging JavaScript, just this, and then just some other sort of practical tips or things that I've picked up on that might be important. So you're thinking, debugging JavaScript, we don't even have any code yet. Why are we talking about that? So there's different ways to do debugging. The first one that you probably encounter is alert-driven development, or ADD. So just if that's all that you're doing, then you're going to learn some things. So let's open up the console. So this is actually a web app. So if you think like live coding is bad, actually having your slides running on a single page app is much more terrifying. OK, and sources. OK. All right, so console log is the next one that everybody sort of knows about and uses in their application. It's pretty simple, especially coming from PHP when you're used to just echo or DD or var dump or dump and die, which is pretty popular, I guess. That's a basic one, so I don't even really have to go over that. It keeps losing every time I click out of the slide. It loses context. Okay, the next one is console.dir, which acts basically just like console.log in Chrome. I've heard it works a little differently in Firefox. I haven't used it personally. But the one difference that it does have is that if you are logging a DOM element, when you do console.log, it actually just gives you the DOM element on the, in the console, whereas if you do console.dir, you actually get the properties, the actual object that is associated with that DOM element. So you have all of the properties here to look at, which is pretty neat. So it's just a nice little trick to know about, I guess you could say. The next one is console.error. You might find use for it. It's basically console.log, except if you're given an error in JavaScript, there's a stack trace for the error and what the code execution was before that. So if you do console.error, it actually adds that right there in the console for you. So, kind of convenient. So the next one that is maybe not as familiar to people coming from PHP is the debugger statement. So I guess breakpoint debugging or stopping the execution of your process as it's running is not necessarily as familiar in PHP because it's harder to set up. You can do it, but you have to sort of hook up much more tooling. Whereas with JavaScript, you can just pop open the Chrome console and throw this debugger statement in there, and everything just stops in time, basically. And what you have then is the ability to jump back through the call stack line by line and see where, when that debugger is called, where it came from. And then also, over here, you have the scope variables. So I can see what the value of this is. And I can see what's in my closure scope. And I can see what's available on the global object. And as you jump back through the call stack, also down here in the console, all the values that are available to you at this time. So if I do action, I can see a method that has a debugger, this array to call this method, is available. So you can think of some times where you maybe have some weird regular expressions you need to work with, or you have something that's just giving you an error. The debugger can be nice, especially if you have code that's maybe breaking and you don't know where. You can just throw debugger just anywhere in the JavaScript code that you're working with, and it'll stop it automatically right there. And let's see. All right, so the next thing then is breakpoint debugging, which is like debugger, except it's much more flexible. So let's see. On this line 71, I said set a breakpoint. So you can click on, if you're in the sources tab, you can click on the line number that you want to set a JavaScript breakpoint. And let me refresh the slide. And it will stop the execution. So when you set up, when you're using source maps, it's sort of a minor inconvenience, but it doesn't give you the highlighted line because it has some magic with source maps. So I've set the breakpoint here, and now I can use these tools right here, which let me either step into the function call, step out of the current function, or step over the next function call. So if I step into this right here, then I can see how it's going through the jQuery, line by line, and everything that's available to me in my scopes and my closure scopes. And it's just a super, super convenient way of being able to understand, because JavaScript is, let's face it, it's sort of out there. And so having this ability to stop execution and look around at everything that's available can be really nice. So I'm like, OK, I don't need to see how all the rest of this works, so let me jump back out and then jump back out. And now I'm back here where I was setting the breakpoint. So breakpoint debugging is super convenient just to be able to click on any line and have it stop execution there. Let's see. So I set the background to blue. OK, and then another one that is a little less familiar even is that you can edit any of the code in here, and it gives this asterisk next to the file. And I can see what the local modifications to the file were. Huh. That's weird. It was working earlier. Let's see. Well, yeah, so anyway, you can edit the files and then have it so that you can save the changes, and it gives you this really, oh, here we go, came up. So it gives you this nice little diff of what you've actually changed in the file since it was last saved or last updated. So you can revert the line changes that you make to each piece, and that's just really, really nice to know about and to use. And each of the frameworks that I mentioned also come with their own debuggers that you can install to the Chrome console. So if you search for Backbone debugger or Ember debugger, Angular debugger, they all sort of have their own little ways of whatever the conventions are for the libraries. They sort of make it easier to work with everything that's around the state. I've used the React debugger a bit. And another thing that's also pretty neat is that if you ever have a situation where you have to work with some JavaScript in Node.js for whatever reason, I'm sure some people have told me that they have. A cool thing to know about is the Node Inspector project, where you can actually hook up a headless, basically the Chrome console, but you can have it running in a tab and do this step through and breakpoint debugging and debugger, but actually with requests on the server side. So you can set a debugger as the request comes in and then step through line by line as it executes on the servers. Just pretty cool to know about. And there's a million other cool tips and tricks that you can do. I'll put these slides up. This is actually a Laravel app that this is running on right now, so you'll have these links. So the next topic I'm just going to touch on is this. And this is a confusing topic to a lot of developers when they come to JavaScript, just because you're so used to this being the way it is in PHP, and then you start using JavaScript, and really you start using jQuery, and you're like, oh yeah, this is just the thing that I wrap in the $ with the parens, and then keep chaining off of. And it's funny, I don't know if John's here today, but this is actually supposed to be the exception to the rule, where you're making this not the object that you're, so jQuery, they do it consistently, so it's great, setting it to whatever is convenient at the time, and it works, perfectly, but it skews everyone's sort of understanding of what this actually is. So in JavaScript, this is your context, and context is sort of, it's dependent on how you call the function, really. So the rule that I use to remember what it is it's the left of the dot rule. So if it's user say name, then this is the user object. If it's user friends add, this is the user friends object. In this case, it's the console object. And then if you don't have it, then it's global. And another thing that I think gets lost sometimes when you're using this is that sometimes there's a method that calls for a callback, and you pass it a callback like let's see, user.greet. So in this case, passing a function as an argument, since functions are first class, you can just pass them all around as much as you want. You lose the context of this. So this user create snappy, and then the callback you want to be user.greet. So presumably in there you have this dot something else that's on the user object. But really what it's doing is it's sort of taking that away and it's treating that as an object. And there is no this, or there is no user when it's getting called. It's just one function, really. So the workaround for this is to pass it a function. This is common if you're ever using promises with JavaScript. I've seen people where you have to pass it the handler for the promise. It's a common thing that people just don't really pick up on right away. But whenever you don't have the before the dot rule, this is the workaround. So that's left of the dot, and then the exception to that is except when it's not. So there's these three Clever, right? So there's bind, call, and apply are three things that are really good to know about if you're writing a decent amount of JavaScript, or even if you're just looking at JavaScript that's already out there, because libraries like jQuery use call and apply all the time to make that value of this whatever they want it to be, really. The DOM element is usually what it is, the DOM node. And so you can sort of think of call and apply similar to call user func or call user func array in PHP. I don't know how often people actually use those in their code, because those are usually used by frameworks under the hood and take care of that for you. But sometimes you also want to get the arguments that are passed to a function. And in JavaScript, all you have to do is just put the word arguments somewhere in the function, and then that's the object that has the arguments that were passed to that function. And so you're probably thinking, all right, well, this is pretty, when would I ever really use this? And so it's used for monkey patching. So if you ever have a case where there's a method that you want to sort of wrap and add some functionality before or after, but you don't have the ability to necessarily inherit using the prototype, you can wrap it and do, so I reassigned the actual function itself to the variable picker click, and then I replaced the click method on the prototype of this date picker and added some functionality here, and then I can apply, call pickerClick.apply. So now when I'm calling that method, it thinks that the value of this is what it currently is, and then you pass it the arguments that it was originally called with. So it's a really common pattern, and you'll pick up on it more if you look at how different libraries do things underneath, and it can be really nice if you know about it, just to be able to use that functionality and maybe not necessarily have to copy over an entire huge method, but you can just sort of wrap it that way. So I mentioned earlier that JavaScript is really object-oriented, which is sort of a surprise to people, I guess, off the bat sometimes, because you're used to hearing about it with closures and with anonymous functions. But it's really object-oriented. But it's actually just confusingly object-oriented with prototypes, which are sort of this everybody in all the languages use the classical inheritance model, except for JavaScript is really the only one that's popular that doesn't use that. And it's so surprising to people when they come to JavaScript and say, what is all of this stuff going on here? And all the major libraries sort of hide this away. So if you're ever developing like a jQuery plugin, you have $.fn, which is really, they've just aliased that to like $.prototype, because under the hood it uses prototypes. And one thing that sort of stuck out to me in learning JavaScript is that when I found out that functions are actually constructors for this prototype thing, that this looks pretty similar to the equivalent PHP, where you have the constructor and you pass it a variable, and then you have say_name where you echo hello say_name. Like, this looks pretty comparable. It's just that the prototype is taking the place of the class body. And so, I thought, okay, well, I can write object-oriented code similar to PHP. So this was pretty eye-opening. It was pretty neat. And what was then kind of weird is that functions are also objects. So you can statically assign just by doing user.name equals not Tim. And back here, I defined that this.name, if you pass in name, is assigned to the object. So depending on how you use it, if it's user.name or a new instance of a user, that it's a different value, which is a little confusing at first. And I've said probably several times that this is confusing. So if you're ever confused about it, just go back to the debugger thing. That's why I tried to emphasize it's pretty cool. You can always stop and look around and see what's going on in your application execution, and sort of then deduct what's going on. Why is it acting the way it is? So some just like additional practical tips that I found that I didn't pick up on right away coming to JavaScript, that hopefully somebody else hasn't either, and I'm helping them, is that arrays are objects, and objects are always references in JavaScript. And because arrays are sort of used as this combination of a hash and an array in PHP, and I've heard them referred to as like the super glue of the universe in PHP. I forget where that was from, but you use arrays for everything. And so you think, okay, well, if I'm creating a object in JavaScript, then these are pretty much equivalent. The creating an array is sort of like a hash, and that's basically what an object is. And it's not really quite like that. It's more like creating a new, oh, I missed the semicolon. It's more like creating a new object. And so right here, if I have this PHP function, add last name, and I have a JavaScript array, and I pass that JavaScript array to this function, add last name, the expected result would be that first name Tim, and then when I var dump the response from that, it would be first name Tim, last name Griesser. Whereas in JavaScript, when you do that, it actually is mutating the object. It's passing it, it's the actual object that you're modifying there. So that just sort of tricked me, and still does. Sometimes I'll just forget that maybe I'm grabbing an object, especially if you're dealing with deeply nested, like Mongo, or deeply nested JavaScript objects, where you maybe like pull off an array from somewhere down the tree, and then maybe mutate it a little bit, and then realize that you're actually changing the original. And it's sort of a tricky concept. It's definitely bitten me plenty of times. So the solution to this typically is to use, this is the underscore clone method, and basically it slices the object if it's an array, otherwise it uses the underscore dot extend. And so in this case, I'm then cloning the argument up there, and we're good. Oh, I didn't include the console log. It works the way it did in PHP, so that's nice. This actually bites you sometimes if you're ever using, if you ever set an array or an object as a prototype property, which I've seen happen, let's see. Oh yeah, so I set this nicknames array on the prototype for the user object. And then I create a new user with my name, and then I add a nickname to my instance. And so it works as expected. Another, oh man, code's all wrong. User.nicknames Tim. And then I create another user and push in nicknames onto that object. And now it still includes the original because you're mutating the property on the prototype. And so it's a little out there, but the place that I've seen it run into when I'm helping out with Backbone is that a lot of times you'll set defaults on an object where you'll set, and under the hood this is sort of setting it to a prototype property, and you're not thinking that it's actually the value that's going to be used by every single instance when I create a new account. So it's just a thing that you can run into, and good to know how to work around it. So the solution here is just always to create new objects inside the constructor. Don't put them on the prototype. And again, if you don't understand why something is the way it is, just use the debugger. That's just the go-to. And this is a little too much to get into, but just scopes and references and sometimes garbage collection, because you're not necessarily used to a long-running app in PHP, sort of the, well, maybe with React PHP you are now, but you don't have the concept of the window not refreshing like you do in a single-page app. Sort of when the request comes in PHP, it sort of goes through, and you don't really have to worry about garbage collection nearly as much. So all this stuff can be really confusing, and again, just use the debugger and see. It's good to look and see what's around. That's just been my sort of go-to. I was looking around to see if there's any cool projects related to Laravel that are using JavaScript, and I came across this one, Laravel, which generates Laravel route URLs from JavaScript, and it's sort of similar to what you would use, I guess, on the server to generate sort of links automatically. And I thought that this would be a good time to point out that maybe if you're not building an entire single-page application, it would be good to avoid the practice of throwing just random script tags in your view partials as you're rendering your Blade templates. Maybe to see if you can create a single JavaScript file and split up the functionality maybe based on the URL. Maybe you could have some regular expressions matching against the URL, similar to what you have with Laravel routes, and sort of split up the JavaScript so it's more compartmentalized and not just sort of ad hoc with the parcels that you're rendering. That's sort of what I would think a Laravel JS would look like, actually, if it existed. And so how do you do that? My go-to right now is Browserify. This is a way of using common JS modules on the server. So, or sorry, it's not just for the server. You can use it in the browser as well. And it allows you to sort of create individual files and then require them similar to maybe what you would expect from namespace. It's basically namespacing your code by the file system. So just for anyone interested, my front-end toolkit right now sort of looks like this. I use Browserify and Watchify for my asset compiling. jQuery_gulp is great. Definitely watch the tutorial on Laracast I did about that. Moment.js is sort of like, I think the library is Carbon in PHP, where it just handles everything related to dates that you possibly need. So that's always a great one to have around. And my two right now are Backbone.js, mostly for the models and collections, and then React for the just for the UI stuff. It's been difficult. I'm excited when more tooling comes out, when it matures a little bit more with React. But really, you can sort of swap that out with whatever you think makes sense for you right there. And one more source. So it was sort of hard to pick and choose what to go over here, because there's so many different topics in JavaScript that I could have spent an entire talk on any one of these minor little things. So this is a new resource that I came across recently called superhero.js. And it's superherojs.com, really. But it just has all these awesome articles on how to create and maintain good JavaScript, and probably way better than most of this talk. So that's pretty much everything. I figured there would definitely be some questions, but it's not as bad as you'd think. I don't know.
Time for a couple questions.
Yes.
I know a lot of people, especially I've been dabbling in Angular, and a lot of the activists and the people in IRC who are full-on Angular developers yell at me when I say I want to use Angular to utilize the two-way data binding in just invoice creation form. And people argue that if you're not building the whole app in Angular, just use jQuery or something like that. Do you have any insights into if you can use it for just a small part of your web app, or what?
I would kind of tend to agree with that, just because you're sort of, it'd sort of be, if you're starting a PHP project where all you need is one simple little class, you don't need an entire framework necessarily. I'm sure you definitely could, but two-way data binding I don't think is necessarily that important. I guess it's pretty simple to implement yourself with some bindings. I'm sure there's plenty of jQuery plugins out there that sort of do that for you, but I would tend to agree that you don't need something the scale of Angular. If anything, I would say more like Backbone with, there's plenty of two-way data binding libraries, and it's much smaller, I guess. So, yeah, Knockout's another good one. I was going to talk about that. I didn't know where to cut it off, but Knockout is another great framework to check. There's 36 of them. So I'm sure there's something, but I think, yeah, maybe Angular is overkill for just that, because there's so many different libraries that do two-way, like Knockout, great example. Yes?
So I don't know if you touched on this with your monkey patching example, but I have like a wrapper around like console log and things like that, so I can have like a testing flag, or I can just see various data, extra stuff. But whenever I use it, it doesn't give you the right line number, because you're replacing it. It just references the same number all the time for where I define the function at. Is there a way that you can get the right line number?
Oh, interesting. There was as I was coming up with some of this for the monkey patching specifically, there was an article I was reading on wrapping console.log, because I guess apparently you weren't able to do that in previous versions of Chrome or Firefox. Like, now you can. So there might be some ways to preserve that. I'm not sure off the top of my head, though, if there is or not. But I'm sure there's probably some people that would know how to, yeah. It does, correct. So
there you could get the actual line.
Well, it gives you the stack trace if it's an actual error. So were you saying specifically where the console log was used, or?
Yeah, like if you do a console.log normally, it shows you as soon where you put it
Right.
So if you wanted to have like several of them set to see like a flow through the application rather than watching the local variables, whatever. Like, it doesn't tell you where they're actually being called, which one is where.
Right. Right. No, off the top of my head, I'm not sure. Sorry.
Any more? All right. Well, he'll be around, I'm sure.
Oh yes.
One more.
Oh.
Which of these frameworks do you think, in your experience, are most suitable for mobile web apps?
For mobile web apps. So I think it really depends, like what you're trying to do. In what sense, I guess, good for mobile web app. Like some are good for size. So it really depends on what you're looking. From a performance standpoint, I mean, I know that Backbone has been used by a lot of different companies that like Walmart Mobile, for example, they're pretty big. There's a few others. I think SoundCloud may have their like mobile web app using Backbone. But yeah, I'm not sure performance-wise specific to mobile. Yes.
For single-page applications, what is your take on like frameworks like GWT, which compiles
The frameworks like GWT, Web Toolkit. I'm not familiar with GWT too much, but I'm sure gets the job done like all the other. There's so many tools in JavaScript. It's really hard to even keep up, but I can't speak specifically to that.